this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Late in 1942, after the success of Operation Torch, the Allies finally gained a foothold in North Africa. What followed was a hard-fought and often overlooked campaign in Tunisia, a brutal contest that would see some of the toughest fighting of the war, as British, American and French troops faced seasoned Axis forces desperate to hold on to their last toehold on the continent. It was a campaign of contrasts, victory and miscalculation, cooperation and rivalry. It would shape how the Allies fought together for the rest of the war. To tell that story, I'm joined by historian and author Saul David, whose new book, Tunisgrad, How the Allies Won North Africa and Set the Stage for D-Day, brings to life the drama, the chaos and the human cost of the campaign. So thanks for joining me. So I think perhaps we should start by setting the scene. What was the situation in North Africa in the run-up to the Tunisian campaign? Certainly, November 1942 had proved to be a double blow for the Germans.
Well, the fighting began in North Africa a couple of years earlier in 1940. In fact, September 1940, so almost exactly 2 years earlier, when Mussolini decided to create his new Roman Empire in North Africa and bridge the gap actually between a colony that Italy had held since 1911, that's Libya, and one that he'd recently got his hands on in East Africa, which was Abyssinia. And the country in the way, or one of the countries in the way, was Egypt. So if you can get your hands on Egypt, not only will you be able to create this land bridge down to Abyssinia eventually, but you can also get control of the Suez Canal. Strategically, for the Italians, this would be interdicting the British supply lines to the rest of their empire, and it would allow them really to dominate the Mediterranean. So there was a lot of sense in trying to get to the Suez Canal. But first of all, you had to get through a British and Commonwealth force, which was in Egypt, not as part of, people often think of Egypt as an imperial possession. It never was, but it was a country that we'd had a mandate over for a while. And we also had a lot of economic influence there, and we'd still retained a garrison of troops.
What's interesting about that is that the Germans obviously get dragged in. What's the strategic goals to carry on fighting there for the Axis powers, the British, Americans and the Germans and the Italians? Because certainly by 1942, the Germans could have put their troops elsewhere to more use and not necessarily felt that threatened by North Africa if they're just giving it up.
Well, it's interesting the way the campaign develops. I mean, initially, Mussolini has a certain amount of success. His troops are able to invade Egypt and push the British and Commonwealth troops back, mainly because they've got 5 times as many troops as the British and Commonwealth troops. Relatively small force there is only 36,000 strong, whereas Graziani's 10th Army, the Italian army that's invading, is about 150,000 strong. So they're much bigger in numbers, but they don't keep driving forward. They're relatively hesitant. They're at long lines of supply, at the end of long lines of supply, which is a bit of a theme in the North African fighting. And so they bed in once they've crossed the Egyptian border and build a series of strong points. And this allows the British and Commonwealth troops to counterattack in an operation, actually, at the end of 1940, Operation Compass, which was really only a reconnaissance in force, but it has so much success infiltrating between these various Italian strong points, which then fold and collapse, that the campaign keeps going. And they get all the way by January, halfway through Libya. I mean, they're closing in on Tripoli, the capital of Italian Libya, and they're only distracted from getting all the way. There's no question they would have been able to get all the way there, but for the fact that the Greece campaign gets in the way. And people have often said afterwards, well, that was Churchill's brainchild. It all went horribly wrong and it was a big mistake. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, you can see it that way. But Churchill's strategic aim with the Balkan campaign, or at least the Greece campaign, was to try and stop the Axis forces from extending all the way into the Balkans. That's, of course, not just Greece, but also Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and ultimately Turkey. I mean, this was really absolutely vital to keep the Turks out of Axis influence. So there was a lot of sense in the Greece campaign, but it went very badly wrong. So what the Greece campaign allows the Germans to do is send some reinforcements. And you're quite right. You make the point, well, surely they're going to be used more usefully elsewhere. In reality, they don't send many troops to begin with. It's the Africa Corps under Rommel, just 2 divisions strong initially. This is eventually going to get beefed up to become what was known as the Panzer Army. And Rommel, as we know, has a lot of success. But you've really got this kind of, without going into too much detail, you've got this toing and froing across the desert as first the Germans attack and then the Allies counterattack. And so you get these huge movements across the desert, which really draw in ever more Italian troops, ever more German troops. But also, on the other hand, the Western Allies have to be beefed up as well. And so by November 1942, the point at which the story of Tunisgrad starts, Montgomery has just won the Battle of El Alamein, which is seen as the great turning point in the Desert War for obvious reasons. This is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is the end of the beginning, Churchill famously says. And it is true that it was a turning point and that there would be no going back from this point. But what also happens 4 days later, of course, are the landings at Torch. And the combination of the victory at Alamein, the withdrawal of Rommel's troops back to Libya, and the landings, the Allied landings in Torch, really mean that ultimately Rommel's going to be squeezed in a vice between Allied forces on both flanks unless the Germans can do something about it. And it's their decision to do that, I think, that's the most remarkable thing about the Axis campaign, because finally Hitler wises up when he hears there have been landings in Torch and thinks, oh, hold on a second, actually North Africa, not only for keeping my ally in the war, not only for getting the chestnuts out of the fire for Mussolini, but also because strategically North Africa is very important, both the possibility, as I already said, getting to the Suez Canal, but even if you don't, it's a defensive redoubt that stops the Western Allies getting into southern Europe, so into the sea lanes of the Mediterranean, into southern Europe. And so it is at the last minute, really, that he realizes that actually he needs to help Mussolini hold on to North Africa, which is when he doubles down and orders the sending of as many troops as possible, frankly, into Tunisia to prevent the collapse of Tunisia and the inevitable destruction of Rommel.
Now, the curious thing about this North African campaign is that a lot of it, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, they're Vichy French. So one might have thought from the point of view, the landings of Torch, that works in their favour. And certainly Vichy France had a tremendous amount. I didn't realise how many troops are based in North Africa. It's a huge amount of troops. I don't know how much those countries are centrally controlled, or were they very, very independent-minded, the countries? Where do those sympathies lie within those Vichy French territories?
Well, the sympathies of the locals were questionable, of course. I mean, effectively, they were French colonies, in which case you had a certain amount of pieds noirs, as they were called, which is basically Frenchmen who've gone to live in those North African colonies, work there, set up businesses there, and of course become involved in both military forces there, but also in local government. But you've also got a much more central control, particularly in Algeria, actually, which was the biggest of the three, the most important of the three, and the one most closely associated with France. I mean, it sent its MPs all the way to Paris. I mean, they were represented in Paris. But in a nutshell, the French had overall control over the foreign policy and military of those three countries. And therefore, when the Western Allies decided to invade, they very much had to calculate that if the French forces there, as you say, quite strong, about 120,000 strong, not very powerfully equipped with important things like air force and tanks and heavy equipment, but there were a lot of troops there, particularly with coastal guns, who could have done a lot of damage to the arrival of the Western Allies. So it was very fortunate that when they arrived, the French were taken completely by surprise, and they had a rather clever plan of landing on the side of these various key ports like Casablanca, Algiers, and Oran. Those were the three main objectives. They didn't decide to go further east to Tunisia, which would have been sensible, of course, because that was the bit that, of course, the Germans could reinvade because it's so close to Sicily. From a strategic position in the Mediterranean, Tunisia is really the vital country because it's a choke point, basically, in the Mediterranean. And if you control the Tunisian shoreline, you're basically able to interdict shipping that can come through there. So it was absolutely vital location. Everybody knew it was going to be central to the fight once the Western Allies had landed in North Africa. But that what they didn't want to do is come too far east with the initial landings, because they knew that the Italians and the Germans would then be able to use air power against them. So that's the thinking. As far as the French reaction is concerned, the French troops were in a very difficult position. Technically, they were under Vichy control, which meant France, Pétain in France. And that was a neutral power, but it was one, of course, heavily influenced by Germany and wasn't going to do anything to anger the Germans, for sure. The Germans were hoping, if anyone ever did try and invade French North Africa, and they had considered it as a possibility, that the French, Vichy French would fight as they would if anyone invaded them. But this wasn't necessarily going to be the case, because the Western allies, particularly the Americans, had spies inside Vichy French North Africa who were basically speaking to some of the military people there who said, yeah, we'll come over onto your side. I would suggest that the majority weren't of that opinion. It was only going to be a minority. And it was just a question of how the initial fighting was going to go. So there was a real threat that the French would fight long and hard. And indeed, they do combat each of the landing forces. Not on the initial landings because they're taken by surprise, but certainly as they try to move into these ports of Oran, Algiers and Casablanca. And for a time, it's getting quite nasty. And they certainly delay the capture of French North Africa by the Western allies, by the opposition that they put up against the landing forces. So for a time, it's looking quite bloody, but it's quite fortunate, I suppose, in a way that the commander-in-chief of Vichy forces, a man called Admiral Darlan, is in North Africa at the time, and he's persuaded in negotiations with the Western allies to actually get his men to lay down their arms and let the invading forces move through French North Africa to their objective, which of course is Tunisia, as I've already mentioned. And you now get the so-called race for Tunisia. You know, who's going to get there first? Who's going to be able to prevent the other side from dominating Tunisia? And ultimately, it's going to be the Italians and the Germans who win that race.
I'm intrigued about those landing sites for Torch, because I honestly did not put any thought into the landing sites until I looked at them on a map. And I realised that Casablanca's on the Atlantic, Oran is 300 miles east of that, and then 200 miles from Oran is Algiers. It's a tremendous spread, and I understand that they're aiming for those ports. Does this reflect a huge overconfidence of the Allies, or perhaps an innocence in their abilities? Because I'm not sure any of the landings they do after this is on such a wide geographic scale.
Not only are they landing on beaches that are hundreds of miles apart, but they're also coming from hundreds of miles away. I mean, some of the American forces come as far as the United States. They've literally sailed across the Atlantic, and all the rest of the forces have at least come as far as the UK. So it's a massive distance. Some of them have stopped off on Gibraltar on the way, but basically, you know, they're at the end of an enormously long line of supply. So the logistics are off the charts for this operation. And of course, it will be superseded by Sicily, Italy, and D-Day, of course. But at the time, it was the greatest amphibious operation that had ever been mounted in history up to that date. So a lot could go wrong. A lot did go wrong. They didn't have anything like the right amount of information on the beaches, the kind of nature of the beaches, the gradients, all those sort of things that you need to land troops safely, and the landing tanks and heavy equipment safely. They didn't have a lot of that information. So it's very fortunate that, unlike D-Day, of course, they weren't actually opposed on the beaches. They were able to make these mistakes and muddle their way through. But as I say, once they're on the ground and they're moving on the cities, there is a lot of fighting and a lot of lives lost as a result on both sides. So the idea that the French weren't going to fight to defend French North Africa was inaccurate. Some had agreed to lay down their arms early, but I'd say the majority continued fighting until Admiral Darlan 2 days later does a deal. And it's quite a cynical deal, actually, because he's being told by the authorities in France to keep fighting. What he realizes is, we're never going to win this. The Western allies are going to pump in more and more troops and forces. We are going to be defeated in the end. So what's the best I can get out of this? Well, he gets an agreement from the allies to continue as military and civilian commander in French North Africa, you know, for the foreseeable future. This is not very popular, actually, with the politicians back home, because Darlan has a reputation of being an arch collaborator with the Nazis. And there was a feeling we need someone more pro-Western allied, a man called General Giraud, who they wanted to take over and set up in control of all French forces there. But anyway, in the meantime, Darlan takes control until, fortunately for Eisenhower, who's criticized for doing this deal with him, he's assassinated on Christmas Day. And as a result, that problem is removed.
Does the French commander in Tunis have enough to actually stop the Germans? Because he could have played a pivotal point once he knew which way the wind was blowing to almost cut the head of the snake off before or started arriving, because they flood in the Germans, don't they? After they had touched on it.
Yeah, the key moment comes in Tunisia, and this all comes within that 2 or 3 day period immediately after the landings on the 8th of November. And the key character in Tunisia is Admiral Esteba, who's the local French representative. And he effectively follows orders from France, which is to allow the Germans and the Italians to come in. Initially just the Italians and then the Germans too. He will later say, well, I was just following orders, don't blame me. I mean, de Gaulle says you had, your one chance, the great free French leader, you had your one chance to, to redeem yourself, and you don't do it. And as a result, of course, this arrival of Axis forces, which was assisted by the French initially, some of the French forces then go over to the Allied side and fight against them later on. But it's all too late. This 2-3 day period right at the beginning was when the Germans and the Italians were able to get forces across, and they're able to get enough of across, maybe about 15,000, to set up a series of blocking positions around the key ports of Tunis and Bizerta, which is what the Allies want to get their hands on. And they managed to defeat the Western Allied forces that are coming in, or at least stop them getting there, and therefore win, as I say, the so-called race for Tunis, which by Christmas is effectively over because the weather's worsening and it's not really campaigning weather. So, they were hoping to get there by Christmas. They don't manage it, and therefore the campaign's going to drag on for a bit longer. We
should probably talk about the terrain, because the geography of this part of North Africa is not the deserts of El Alamein, is it? It's very different.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, some people might imagine that Tunisia is just more of the same, where you've got a sort of coastal plain and then desert beyond that. And even the coastal plain is pretty inhospitable. Well, there is a certain amount of coastal plain. There is a certain amount of desert in Tunisia in the south, but the rest of it's mountainous, basically. We're not talking about huge mountains, but we are talking about, up to 1,000 feet high, that are very easy to hold from a defensive position and very difficult to fight your way through. If you look at a picture of Tunisia, it's often described akin to a pregnant belly. So you've got the flatter bit at the top, and then you've got this big curve coming out, and running as a spine right the way through the center from north to south is effectively an inverted V of 2 mountain ranges. And it's in those mountain ranges that a lot of the fighting of the Tunisian campaign is going to take place in pretty awful conditions, rain, snow, wind, very bad conditions through the winter. And it's, really difficult for both sides actually to supply themselves and to live, to survive, keep warm enough and able to fight in those mountains. So it becomes a pretty grim struggle to who can gain control of the mountain passes.
These forces coming in from the west, sort of under Anderson's First Army, it's the first time the British and the Americans have fought together. How well do the two sides integrate?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big things about the campaign, is that there will be teething problems between the British and Commonwealth forces and the Americans, on the other hand, because they do things very differently. Certainly the British think, well, we've got a lot of experience already. We've been fighting since 1939. Although it's true that many of the British and Commonwealth forces that land in French North Africa haven't seen much action, actually. I mean, 1 or 2 have been in the Dunkirk campaign, but most of them have been training back in the UK. The American forces are completely green. They've never faced the Germans before. They've never faced the Italians before. They don't really know what they're in for, and they do take a bit of time to get up to speed. There's a lot of criticism you see in the early letters and diaries and and sort of verbal interactions between the British and the Americans, along the lines that the Americans are very green and they're inexperienced and they should let the British take the lead. And I'm not really sure that was fair. I mean, what you see with the Americans is how quick they are to learn from their errors. And it's not just them making errors either. At the beginning, the British, because they were really relatively inexperienced in the early fighting in northern Tunisia, are also getting defeated by the Germans and the Italians. So it's a business of beginning to understand how the other side does things. And one of the reasons why they were able to sort of get over their initial problems is because Eisenhower, as Allied commander-in-chief, was absolutely determined that there would be no bad feeling between the nationalities. I mean, he made sure that all his staff was a mixture of British and American. And he also said, if there's any criticism on national grounds, you're going to lose your job immediately. He has a famous moment early in 1943 when one of his staff officers, an American, calls a British staff officer, "You British, expletive." And Eisenhower's point is, if you just you use the expletive, that's fine, but you can't say the national word and think that that's going to be okay, because that sort of underlines the bad feeling. It's not as though this stopped. It carried on all the way through the campaign, but slowly but surely they began to learn each other's way of doing things. And the fact that each of them had, their own particular attributes when fighting a war. I mean, the Americans were wonderful at logistics, for example. I mean, they brought in an enormous quantity of material and ultimately become the great suppliers of the Allied forces in French North Africa. Yes, the British Navy, the Royal Navy plays a big part, but in terms of logistics, once they're on the ground, that's really the Americans doing most of the heavy lifting. And that was much appreciated, I think, not just by the ordinary British soldiers, but also the senior commanders, including men like General Anderson, who was Britain commanding the First Army.
I always think Anderson gets overlooked, and I'm not sure if he's overlooked when you think back on the campaign, because there's other personalities like Patton and Monty that kind of paint him out of the picture with their bright stars. There
is a bit of that. I mean, if you look at some of the key characters in the story of the Tunisian campaign, and some of them, of course, have fought earlier in North Africa, in Egypt and Libya, you've got people like Alexander, Montgomery, Bradley on the American side, Patton you mentioned. You've obviously got Eisenhower, and then you've got a lot of the air commanders who will go on to do great things in the D-Day campaign, people like Cunningham, Tedder. And so what you realize is that actually the first 11, as far as senior Allied command, is welded together during the fighting in Tunisia. They learn how to get on, they learn how to work with each other. There is a certain amount of mutual respect as well as mutual suspicion. It's true. I mean, if you were talking about mutual suspicion, I don't think Patton ever really respected the British, and Monty wasn't a great fan of the Americans per se either. But those two slightly difficult, irascible characters apart, I think there was a lot of mutual respect, particularly from people like Alexander, who was a little bit like a mini Eisenhower. He was very good at getting on with all his subordinates, but also very good at getting on with the business of coalition warfare, which is all about relationships and finding a way to operate best with people who do things slightly differently to you. So I think they were very lucky with the team that welded together out there, and its success in Tunisia was replicated ultimately in Sicily, Italy, and of course D-Day and the campaigns thereafter.
Yeah, poor old Anderson doesn't see the campaigns after, does he?
No, and you have to ask the question why, actually. Okay, so just in a nutshell, Anderson's fourth choice for command of the First Army. He's done all right during Dunkirk, where he was a brigade commander. He's really a protege of Sir Alan Brooke, the Chief of Imperial General Staff, and that's really why he keeps getting promoted. But was he actually any good? I mean, it's pretty remarkable if you think about it, that his senior rank during the Dunkirk campaign is acting divisional commander, and yet he's army commander by the time of the Torch landings with no more experience. He's had no command experience thereafter. He's just been in charge and promoted back in the UK. So nobody really knew how he was going to operate under pressure. Eisenhower, who liked him as a person, said actually he had weaknesses, and one of his main weaknesses is that he found it very difficult to delegate. He was a micromanager. He was also found it difficult to get on with all his subordinates. I mean, one of the great attributes of any really good general is you pick good people under you and you let them get on with their jobs. And Anderson wasn't really capable of doing that. And yet at the same time, he wasn't decisive when a key decision had to be made. The criticism that he had his headquarters too far from the front, as indeed a lot of his subordinate commanders did. The Americans were very keen to, get up closer to the action. Some of them were, not all of them practiced that preaching. So I think Anderson had flaws, and the fact that he never gets a senior command in combat after the Tunisian camp will give you an indication that actually the people above him, in particular Brooke and Alexander, didn't think that highly of him by the end of the campaign.
It's intriguing because Brooke often would stick by his own people and keep them around, but clearly Anderson's a bit too beige.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a moment during the campaign when people are trying to get him sacked, basically, and the including Monty, who doesn't have a high opinion of Anderson at all, but he doesn't have a high opinion of many people. So he's trying to get him sacked, and the onus is then put on Alexander's. Like, they say to him, look, it's up to you. If you want to get rid of them, then feel free. I mean, Brooke gives him that leeway, and he actually decides not to bite the bullet and sticks with Anderson. And Anderson does all right, particularly towards the end of the campaign, but they really needed a more decisive character in charge of First Army, particularly in those early months in late 1942, when it's just possible a different commander might have got them to Tunis before the Germans and the Italians became too strong.
He was dealt a difficult hand because it's the first time everyone's fighting together. The terrain's more difficult than everyone realizes, and I always feel a bit sorry for him at the end of the day.
He was very upset at the end of the campaign never to be given another job. He could see which way the wind was blowing, and he writes. I think I include an extract of it in the book. He writes a really sad letter to Eisenhower saying, I thought we'd get on. I thought I did all right. I'm really very disappointed, basically, not to be employed in the next stage, because of course they're then going on to Sicily, and there's always planning for Sicily. But Anderson has nothing to do with that. He's eventually given a desk job, I suppose, commanding Second Army back in the UK, training it for D-Day. He was never going to be allowed to command it actually at D-Day, and that job goes to Dempsey, who was a much better choice.
As Monty's pushing in from the west and the Allies have been stalled in those mountains outside Tunis, that must really improve the Axis strategic position. They've almost got a sort of redoubt there, presumably. They can feed men in and hold. And they build a series of defensive lines which Rommel is moving his forces backwards and forwards. Was this the point that the Germans could have said to themselves, okay, let's go, and sat behind and just left? Or are they really determined that this crust that they've got is strong enough to withhold what the Allies are going to throw at them and become attritional for the Allies?
It's very interesting that the situation you get by early 1943, because Rommel's being pushed back by Monty, who's coming in from the east, but you've also got Anderson's First Army and the Americans coming in from the west. So you've got the vice constricting. But as you suggest, the Germans are actually in quite a strong position because the two Allied armies are separate, and yet they're in the center. And as Rommel gets pushed back into Tunisia, they are then able to meet up with the existing army in there, commanded by von Arnim, the 5th Panzer Army. So you've now got these two German forces have joined. They're operating on interior lines, so their lines of communication back to their airfields and their supplies are much shorter. And then they go back to Sicily, which is also not that far away from Tunisia. And yet the Western Allies are having to come over enormous distances, and they're separate. So there was definitely an opportunity, which the Germans tried to take, to defeat one of these enemies after the other. So the plan ultimately was to take on, we'll defeat First Army first. We think, they're the weakest. They're also strung out across these mountain ranges that I was speaking about before, particularly in central and southern Tunisia. And if we can get in their rear and get it all the way up to the coast, we can actually effectively defeat the First Army and force it to withdraw. I mean, Hitler's talking about getting as far as Casablanca, which, sounds like pie in the sky. But a lot of the way that he was talking before the original Blitzkrieg campaign, many of his senior commanders thought was pie in the sky. So we always have to remember, as historians and readers of history, that it's not just about what happened, it's what might have happened. And was there really ever a serious chance that the Germans could defeat, first of all, First Army and then turn on Eighth Army? Yes, I think there was. And that's certainly what they tried. They have a certain amount of success in battles like Sidi Bouzid and Kasserine Pass, these famous battles. Rommel's last victory, actually, is Kasserine Pass. He never wins another victory in the Second World War. And if you consider that it's February 1943, and he'll go on for another year and a half, it's pretty remarkable, really. But he thinks there's a possibility. And with a commander as aggressive and as talented as him, I think he was right. There really was. So how close did we come to defeat? Well, we had a lot of troops in French North Africa by that time, and it would have taken something really special to do what Rommel was trying to do. But he was the man, what was the right man in place to do it? Certainly. I think he's hamstrung by the fact that he's not in overall command of all the German and Italian forces in Tunisia. If he had been, he might have been able to use more armor when he broke through the American lines at Kasserine. And then possibly that might have allowed him to make this big sickle stroke in the rear of First Army and completely dislocate First Army.
The Kasserine Pass, he famously routes elements of the Americans, but I wonder, does that display any problems the Allies had of coalition warfare? How much can we blame the American? It's Frednall, isn't it, who's in charge Kasserine Pass, does it fall on his shoulders, or are there underlying issues that cause that sort of debacle?
The underlying issues for the Allies, particularly First Army and US 2 Corps, they were defending far too long a front. And in the case of US 2 Corps, they were at the southern end of that front and they were hugely strung out. So more of the forces up in the north, because that's where most of the fighting had been. That's where the attempt to get to Tunis and Bizerta, those are really the strategic locations. But because there was a very long front, and because ultimately the plan was to link hands with the 8th Army, we had to send forces all the way down into southern Tunisia. As a result, the US 2 Corps, commanded by Fredendall, who was not a good commander and actually had holed himself up in a kind of bomb-proof shelter miles away from the front line. I mean, even Eisenhower was shocked when he went to see it. He said, "I've never seen a commander build a bomb-proof shelter before. This is not very, American in terms of American generalship. This is really poor form." But Fredendall did have a very difficult job, which is to defend this ridiculously long line with not enough troops. So what he tended to do is group them on hilltops and in what he felt were strategic locations, which sort of made sense given that he didn't have enough troops. But the Germans were clever enough to see the weak spots, and if they could get through them and then surround those strong points, you can capture an awful lot of American troops, which is exactly what happened. I mean, in the series of battles that lead up to Kasserine Pass, they capture more than 4,000 American troops, and they advance more than 80 miles. So it's a tremendously successful campaign as far as it goes. The problem for the Axis forces is time is running out if they're not going to defeat the Western Allies, because all the time we're putting more and more troops and reinforcements into North Africa.
That's in February, isn't it, Kasserine? It all suddenly falls. It's at the end seems very quick. let me put it that it's sort of April, May that all collapses for the Germans. Why does it suddenly collapse when they have quite a good redoubt? They've managed to actually put an effective offensive in, although it went nowhere. Why do they suddenly collapse in April, May?
The big problem for the Germans, they've got two problems, really. Time is running out in the sense that we're bringing in more forces, but we're bringing our airfields closer. At the start, in late 1942, the Germans effectively had air superiority because all their airfields were straight behind the battlefield. We didn't have any airfields close to the fighting in Tunisia, and we had to bring them forward slowly but surely and build them, of course, as we were going. So it's only towards the end of the campaign, towards early 1943, February, March 1943, that we're beginning to bring air power into play. And the other problem the Germans have got by this stage is that they're running out of armor. I mean, the big equalizer on the battlefield is armor. Rommel's done very well at Kasserine because he's using 2 armored divisions to break through there. But of course, they lose so much armor in that operation and in the follow-up battle, which takes place, which is his attempt to defeat 8th Army, and that's at Medellin, which takes place just a week or two after Kasserine. And again, they're heavily defeated there. They've only got 160 tanks at Medellin to begin with, and that's 3 armored divisions. An armored division at that time would usually have 300 to 350 tanks. So they're already hugely undernumbered. A lot of those get lost at Medellin, and they're really shot as far as having armored support by that point onwards. And therefore, the sort of defending divisions, they've still got a lot of troops in French North Africa, as we know, a lot of troops in Tunisia, because we capture an enormous number of troops, but they don't have the heavy equipment and they don't have the air cover that they had a few months earlier.
So, when they collapse, what's the immediate consequences of the Allied victory?
Well, the consequences of the collapse, which happened very quickly, actually, in May, you've got the breakthrough battle, Operation Strike, which gets all the way to the port of Tunis in just 2 days. I mean, they've been fighting to get to Tunis for the previous 6 months, and this final operation gets there in just 2 days. And it's a very well managed battle, actually fought by units from both the 8th and the 1st Army. So they're operating together for the first time. But just a few days after that, the whole of the German and Italian forces in Tunisia surrender. So that's 250,000 guys are captured with enormous quantities of material. And it's really the loss of all of that number of veteran troops that would have been so useful to the Germans in southern Europe that's the first hammer blow and the first kind of consequence of the campaign. The humiliation of losing that number of troops so soon after Stalingrad is why the Germans began to describe the campaign as Tunisgrad. I mean, obviously, this is a kind of ironic, wry reference to it, but not another disaster, not Tunisgrad after Stalingrad. So a psychological blow, but an actual literal blow in the terms of the numbers of soldiers lost. People captured at Stalingrad were about 110,000. So yes, many more were lost in the campaign prior to that. You get a sense of the sort of scale of this. But the other real key loss in French North Africa by the Axis forces is air power. They lose 2,400 of their planes, many of them fighters, many of them ground attack aircraft like Stukas. And this is 40% of the total. And what you see with Germany in the years to come, particularly later in 1943 and 1944, is they're basically losing the ability to fight equally on any of their various battlefields, particularly after Normandy starts, but also on the Eastern Front with air cover. So they had air power when they first invaded Russia, but by 1944, they're outnumbered by Soviet aircraft 10-1. So air power really matters, and they lose an enormous number of planes fighting in French North Africa. But the other really crucial thing is they lose control of the sea lanes of the Mediterranean. And this is going to open up the whole of southern Europe for invasion, but it's going to save the Allies, they reckon, 1 million tons of shipping, because they don't need to go all the way round the southern Cape of Africa. They can just come through the Suez Canal, and they're going to now dominate the sea lanes of the Mediterranean, which, as I say, strategically is going to be a disaster for the Germans. Hitler realized this. Rommel flies over and in March after he's been defeated at Medellin and says, let's get the troops out. And Hitler says, absolutely not. That North Africa is vitally strategic for the defense of southern Europe and for Italy, and I'm not going anywhere. And of course, the consequence of that is all these troops and all these planes and all this material is lost.
It's fascinating how we have chosen to forget that campaign, considering how decisive it is. 250,000 troops is not to be sniffed at. We're not taking that amount of prisoners of war until, I don't know, probably as we're going into Germany and the collapse of Germany. It's a tremendous amount of men.
Exactly right. I mean, they don't take that many, even at the Battle of Falaise. The Falaise collapse, they take maybe 80,000 or so there, and the whole of the D-Day campaign, they capture maybe 150,000. I mean, this is an absolutely extraordinary number of troops. And it's not just the number, it's the quality. I mean, some of the best fighting formations, particularly in the German army, but also in the Italian army. Italians are obviously criticized by many people for their performance in the Second World War, but they had some really good people, and almost all of them are captured in North Africa. So they lose confidence to continue the fight, and Germany loses many of its best veteran formations. So it's an utter catastrophe for Germany. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't been recognized, particularly by Western historians up until this point, is because there's been this preoccupation with D-Day. We should have gone in 42. That's what the Americans were saying. Maybe going in 43. We'll finally go in 44. And everything else looks like a bit of a sideshow without really understanding strategically what was possible in North Africa. And that's what I've tried to bring out in this book. And it's a complete mystery to me. As I describe it in the book, this third key turning point of the Second World War, along with Guadalcanal and Stalingrad, has never really been acknowledged for that. And even today, because this book was reviewed by Richard Overy, who's a friend of mine, of course, a very well-known historian, but he's written about the Eastern Front. He can't quite bring himself to accept that, this can be compared to Stalingrad, even though I've put a lot of statistics and made a lot of arguments in the book and the name itself, Tunisgrad, to indicate that this was another major turning point.
No, and it's absolutely compelling. And it hadn't really occurred to me that it does get lost in all the arguments over D-Day, whether it's Bolero or Sledgehammer. It just gets lost in these endless arguments about not going into Normandy and swept along. Oh, it's a sideshow, it's a sideshow, it's a sideshow. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Saul. Loyal listener, Saul's book is Tunisgrad, How the Allies Won North Africa and Set the Stage for D-Day. It's an authoritative look at the battles in North Africa and how they shaped the rest of the war. Now, before I go, just a quick reminder that the World War II podcast is made entirely by me. I research, record, edit and produce every episode on my own. So if you enjoy the podcast and want to help me keep it going, you can support it by becoming a patron. Patrons get ad-free listening, bonus material, and extended episodes from time to time. You'll find all the details at patreon.com/WW2podcast. So that is it for this episode. Next time, I'll be making a field trip to the National Army Museum in London. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.